Hello, and welcome to the North Coast Journal Preview. This is a show where we take a look at what's coming in the current edition of the North Coast Journal. I am your host, Tanya Schrum, and we are joined as usual by North Coast Journal's news editor, Thad Greenson, and arts and features editor, Jennifer Fumiko Cahill. Welcome to you both.
How you doing, Tanya?
It's a glorious week.
So much glory.
Indeed.
Well, we are going to jump right in with all the glory that's coming to the cover story. Jennifer, you want to fill us in on the mayhem and the madness?
Yes. Shall we splash in?
Let's
Shall
splash.
we drop in? This week we had the annual Kinetic Grand Championship, not to be confused with other Kinetic races. It is our own. And for those of you who follow the Kinetic universe and all of its shenaniganery, this also included the Rutabaga Ball, 3 days of a 50-mile plus race over land and sea and river, and a little change in the course this year. But before we get started in all of that, I would like to extend our congratulations to Grand Champions Flightless or Flyless. I don't know how to pronounce this because it is fly and then like a little T kind of barely written in and then less. And this looked like a semi-crashed airplane that was maybe attacked some bicycles on the way down, and these folks rode it over sand dunes. They rode it through the water. They made maybe one of the biggest splashes into... Wait, did they win biggest? They did win biggest splash, and we've got the photo to prove it if you go online. It's amazing. If you haven't been to the Kinetic Grand Championship, what have you been doing? Did you just get to Humboldt? I'm sorry. The Kinetic Grand Championship started in, of course, Ferndale, and that is where it ends every year. So Hobart Brown was the originator of the Kinetic sculpture race, with people making human-powered art pieces that they could race from the Arcata Plaza all the way down to Ferndale Main Street. It started as a Mother's Day race, but ended up now as an annual Memorial Day weekend sort of tradition that involves lots of wackiness. And when I say wackiness, I think the first Kinetic sculpture I saw go by me without warning, was an enormous shoe. Tanya, you remember the shoe, right?
I do remember the shoe.
It was like this 3-story shoe just going down the road, powered by bicycles on the bottom. And I was like, what do you know? Went on with my day. But
I will say the one sculpture that was my favorite didn't get a lot of accolades, and I was the weekend at Jerry's, I think, was one of the funniest concepts, and I'm like, maybe the kids are too young.
That was a small one. That was what we call a small craft.
Absolutely. But
yeah, I think it has
brilliant. The joke will last me for years.
For those of you who need to Google it, Weekend at Bernie's. There you go. A cultural education. So Flightless won the Grand Championship. They were the first ones over, as I said, the finish line at Ferndale Main Street. But there are lots of legs to the course for the, 48 participating teams this year. Not all of them make it all the way, as demonstrated by, for example, the Golden Dinosaur Award, which goes to Malice in Wonderland for being the first to break down after leaving the plaza. I don't know if they made it over the border, but I hope everybody's okay. This year, instead of going from the plaza to Dead Man's Drop in the Malel Dunes, they went to the dunes but did not do a drop down the hill. They instead went through the sand and over to Halverson Park to camp out for the night and then, party and go to the Rutabaga Ball. followed by the next morning's water crossing on the Humboldt Bay, and then assuming they make it back to land in one piece or pieces that can be reassembled, the next day is for biking. They head to Lolita, and then the next day is for biking down into Ferndale Main Street. The course changed because the Dead Man's Drop, which is a ridiculous, wicked hill that is really meant to flip your crazy vehicle into the sand, was not available this year. The land has been repatriated back to the Wiyot tribe, and it was just a question of timing. There wasn't enough lead time, according to the organizers that I spoke to. Jennifer Thalander told me that there's normally quite a bit of trail preparation that they have to do before everybody goes down there to be eaten by mosquitoes and watch all of these sculptures fall over in the sand. But there just wasn't enough time between the repatriation to prepare everything, get agreements all settled with the new owners, the Wiyot tribe. But they are really hopeful about next year. And I didn't include it in the story because we haven't nailed it down yet. But apparently they're hoping to set up a plan where the folks from the Kinetic universe do some stewardship work year-round on that land. So that's pretty cool. Hoping that comes through. There were a lot of wild teams out there, including, I liked the Ghoul Scouts Pine Box Derby, which is, I think it's Malia Matsumoto is formerly of the ham racing team that has been many different kinds of bat ham and other things. But this was basically a very fancy goth purple coffin on wheels that had a huge Girl Scout-like following that was very Wednesday Addams and much appreciated. The Barbie's Muffin Top was another small single-person craft, and I believe they aced. And to ace means that you carry everything with you that you need for all your crossings. So everything you need to travel on land and everything you need to float across Humboldt Bay and the Eel River. Those are all with you at all times. That is what it takes to ace. Another sculpture that did well, both in name, in execution, because it was a giant fish, you'll see it on the cover of the paper this week, was Brown Chicken, Brown Trout, which I did not understand as a title other than the presence of the chicken and the trout until I was informed by our production department that it is to be pronounced Brown Chicken, Brown Trout. So now, yeah, that's in my head forever, rent-free. The Sardine Dream, a beautiful Magritte-like piece of engineering. And I understand that Team Cluster Duck, which had lots of kids on it, got the Too Much Fun Award, which may have been made up on the spot for them because they needed an award. It was so incredible. A lot of these awards, apparently, over the years, not all of them, are established spontaneously when something is so amazing that you need to award it. But we have wonderful photographs from Alexander Anderson, who was there for all 3 days. Things on fire, going into the water, giant horses, giant dogs. I think the giant dog used to be a giant cat, wasn't it?
I believe so. And I mean that just like the course evolves every year, so do the sculptures.
Yes, I think I'm seeing a little sarcoptic mange on that guy, but he's staying alive. Good for Sparky. So please go and check those out. There's actually a ton in the paper, but there are more online at northcoastjournal.com. You can see Alexander's whole slideshow of all the fun. It's fantastic. And congratulations, and hopefully a good week or more of resting to everybody who pedal powered their way through this thing.
Absolutely, and glory to all involved. Well, with that, because we also have to be adults and talk about what's going on in our country and in our community, we're going to shift to Thad, who's going to report all of the federal changes that affect our community.
Yeah, thanks, Tanya. Before we get to adulting, though, I just have to mention, I think this is the first, well, there was not a single capsize in the water crossing this year, right?
Oh,
or at
that's
least in the
right.
water entry.
Golden
which I believe
flipper.
has to be a first. At least it's the first in my 20 years of watching the race. So
You're right. Usually somebody goes down.
mhm. Am I wrong to say I'm a little disappointed this year? I feel a little bad saying that. Um,
Well, I think it's because we didn't get all of the topsy-turviness of Dead Man's Drop, so then no capsizing,
yeah, little bit of the danger was taken away from us this year. Um, Unfortunately, there's plenty of danger in the rest of the world. So, yeah, this week I did another story looking at just kind of continued impacts from changes from the Trump administration as they trickle down to Humboldt. And I guess before I dive into the three kind of topics covered in this week's story, I think it's just necessary to say that I've never written this much about a presidential administration's impacts locally in the first 5 months of their presidency, 4.5 months. So that in and of itself is just notable. But this week I take a look at some stuff going on at Cal Poly Humboldt, College of the Redwoods, and then growing concern among especially medical providers about what is happening with the appropriations bill that has passed the House, what the Trump administration has labeled the Big Beautiful Bill, and how, if that is passed through the Senate as is, what impacts that will have locally. So starting with Cal Poly Humboldt, folks probably remember they got one of those Dear Colleague letters sent to gazillions of universities across the country back in February, warning of the administration's view that they were running afoul of all kinds of federal mandates by doing things like teaching DEI, teaching accurate U.S. history, and having admissions policies and hiring policies that took DEI issues into account. So this week, the interim president, Michael Spagna, announced that he's been informed that the U.S. Department of Education's Office of Civil Rights has now launched a formal investigation into a complaint that was actually first filed by the Louis D. Brandeis Center for Human Rights under the law, which had filed a complaint last month, basically alleging a lot of anti-Semitic issues at Cal Poly Humboldt that had gone unaddressed, and a fair amount of these center around the pro-Palestine demonstration that turned into an occupation of Siemens Hall and kind of ended up causing administration to shutter the campus at the end of last year. But there's some other issues as well, and I think it's interesting that the administration is taking on this investigation, and the story provides a little bit of context about kind of some of the allegations as they were viewed by local Jewish leaders. Anyway, the leadership of Temple Beth El wrote a letter kind of in real time after the occupation last year, addressing kind of the notion that the protests were inherently anti-Semitic, but then also bringing up kind of their frustrations with the former CPH administration and what they perceived as kind of a lack of urgency in dealing with some real anti-Semitic issues that they were worried about on campus. So that's kind of what's going on at CPH. It's notable that Dear Colleague letter, one of the issues that it pointed out was what they called quote-unquote segregated graduation ceremonies. Cal Poly Humboldt this year did still hold its cultural graduation ceremonies. Included in the invitation was a note that all of the ceremonies were warmly welcoming of all students. So, moving on to the bill that passed the House, this is largely a bill to continue the Trump tax cuts of 2017, which, as the story notes, hugely disproportionately benefit the wealthy, and add the tax cuts themselves add about $3.8 trillion onto the federal budget deficit, and to pass that in a Republican Congress, there's the feeling that there need to be a lot of spending cuts. Those are largely being targeted at safety net programs. And so the two that I look at specifically in the story are the proposed cuts to Medicare, which aren't necessarily cuts. What they are is additional restrictions and additional red tape that the Congressional Budget Office projects will lead about, I think it's more than 10 million people to fall off Medicare in the coming years. And notable in Humboldt County, 23% of Humboldt residents are on Medicare, which is obviously a huge percentage of the population, but includes children and seniors. Both the CEO of Open Door and a spokesperson for Providence Hospital basically predicted that this would have huge and devastating impacts on the delivery of healthcare locally. Also note in the story that SNAP, which is the food nutrition program that's federally funded, is slated for a 30% reduction if this bill passes as is, and 26,000 plus Humboldt County residents are on SNAP. So a 30% reduction in that would be 7,500 people in Humboldt County receiving no food benefits. So finally, the last one is CR. CR caught a lot of people off guard when the Board of Trustees took up a resolution, or was slated to take up a resolution earlier this month that would have rescinded 6 different resolutions that had already passed over the previous 4 years. These are resolutions supporting Pride Month on campus, proclaiming support for undocumented students, committing the campus to DEI principles, recognizing Women's History Month, decrying hate against Asian Americans, and committing the campus to an inclusive environment for all races. Not necessarily inherently controversial stuff. That resolution was pulled kind of at the last minute based on, it sounds like, the intervention of the CR board president. But one of the things that kind of went unnoticed in that whole conversation is that a couple months earlier, the board had voted to basically revise the school's mission and a number of the school's policies to kind of excise words like accessible, diverse, equity, inclusive, inclusion, from all of these documents. And the rationale put forward by the board president and the president of the university were that these changes were action focused, kept the main goals of these policies, missions in place, but insulated the college from what it fears, obviously, is a crackdown from the federal government probably in the form of lost funding.
Which, I mean, I guess that is the strategy, is to try not to be noticed.
I think that's one argument. I think we're seeing universities across the country grapple with this and take different approaches. And what I would say is, it's notable to me that CPH has not taken these steps. It has not revised all of its documents or obviously changed its commencement ceremonies. But I think it's indicative of the pressure that colleges and universities feel at the moment.
Well, and hopefully, depending on what CPH, how they move forward with their investigation, perhaps that will inform CR of when and if they'll put their head above the sand.
Yeah. Well, I will say I know a lot of folks were relieved that they stepped back from rescinding those resolutions, and there was some public comment at the meeting in May. Even though that rescinding resolution didn't come up for discussion, there was some public comment from folks who just talked about the message that would have sent to folks on campus.
Absolutely. Well, do you have any additional thoughts about your reporting at this time?
I encourage folks to pick up the whole story. There's some other things in there. And also just to stay tuned. This is going to be a regular feature of the journal, I feel like, at this point, is updating local impacts of what's going on in Washington.
And I realize that it probably seems overwhelming and exhaustive, but I appreciate all of the North Coast Journal readers. We all are in this together and have to stay informed.
Indeed.
Well, and with that, we are going to turn back to Jennifer, who's going to report on a lovely piece by Louisa Rogers of a local homegrown artist and what she's up to.
Yes, and just a little inside baseball for all of you who are reading at home. This week, Barry Evans in the Field Notes column talks about his wife, Louisa, and you might think, is that the same Louisa? Indeed it is. Louisa Rogers. And they are, my gosh, an interesting couple with diverse interests. Oh, I'm sorry, I'm not supposed to say diverse. But Louisa occasionally writes for us about artists because the thing that makes her really intrigued by our local population is how folks got here if they aren't originally from here. And it's always one of her questions that she will ask somebody. She'll be like, so how did you end up in Humboldt? Or, why have you stayed? What is it about Humboldt that you love? That's always something that speaks to her. And this week, she's talking to Nicolette Rhinesmith about her paintings. And she does ceramics also, and we'll get to that in a bit. But Rhinesmith does these portraits and kind of, I would say, almost like a landscape with people in it, right? Paintings of rural life in Humboldt. Lots of images of folks just, sitting in their kitchens or in lawn chairs on the front yard next to a wood pile. They are very, very much depictions of rural life. And sometimes they have a little humor to them. Sometimes they have a little irony to them. Sometimes they have a personal story attached to them. And she was saying how being away from, just as they say, you're never more American as when you are abroad, so too, you are never more Humboldt than when you are out of county. And when she was at California College of the Arts in San Francisco, she found that lots of her classmates, who were maybe a little bougier than her, were totally lost as to what Humboldt might be, where it is, what kind of people are there. She thought when people would talk about the Redwoods, they kind of meant other places, like, what did they bring up? Like Big Sur?
Big Sur,
that sounds
Oregon.
Crazy. So anyway, she found herself wanting to explain to people, as the title of the story, what life was like here suggests, what she grew up around, what the landscape and the people are like. She says something interesting. She has one painting called Score, Free Fridge, parentheses. It was a piece of, and I can't say that on because there's radio. She says, I paint the people in my community out of love and respect and shared humor. I'm never trying to demean or make fun of anyone. I love Humboldt County and rural life. I love the dirty, grimy, trashy aspects of it. It feels nostalgic to me and comforting and human, which is really something cool to me because we get a lot of people who come from out of area and do work that is very kind of, we've seen photography books of kind of poverty porn or these depictions, like very Murder Mountain depictions of what we're like, and they don't necessarily feel authentic to the whole us. And she is taking this one sliver of the population and of the landscape of Humboldt and paying homage to it and really giving it some love. And as she puts it, some of the things that are thought about as a rural idea, like rural images, rural colors, things that go in a rural landscape, she feels skew masculine. And she also likes to put feminine elements into it because, as she puts it, that's me too. And she wants that idea of what rural life in Humboldt is to not only be reflected, but to expand what somebody might think of as rural life in Humboldt. And she talks about her father's sense of humor. She refers to himself as upper white trash, which I think is hilarious. And she talks about how she wants to make it a more immersive experience and get people to really be able to enter the landscape with her. And she's got an idea to do, when she has a little more time and space to stretch out, to do ceramic pieces of elements that are in her paintings so that they can be placed in the room with you and you can feel sort of enveloped, like you are a part of the piece instead of it just being a two-dimensional image in front. And she talks about how she painted her parents' neighbor, and in it she listened to a lot of music that reminded her of him, and she just puts together all of these different images and things. She takes photographs, she does sketches, and she brings these elements together to make a scene that works for her as a kind of, like in film, you have mise en scène, right? You have everything in the frame that tells you something, sends a message. And she really does that with her paintings. And if you wanted to see more of her paintings and perhaps where she works, She is part of Open Studios, June 6th through 8 and 13 through 6, 13 and 14. And you should pick up a guide for Open Studios and check her out.
Well, thank you for that, Jennifer. And some of her pieces are in the article, but it's definitely definitely time to go check out her work if you can. And that's all of our time for this week. The current edition of the North Coast Journal is available on newsstands tomorrow, or of course you can find it online at northcoastjournal.com. My name is Tanya Schrum. Thanks for being with us, staying informed, staying glorious, and staying supportive here on the North Coast.